There is a particular kind of quiet that only belongs to very old places. Not the silence of an empty room, or the silence of a countryside night, though those are lovely in their own right. This is a deeper quiet, the quiet of centuries stacked on top of one another like layers of stone, like the slow accumulation of soil over things that were once magnificent and blazing and full of sound. It is the quiet of a world that no longer exists, pressing gently against the edges of the world that does. And if you are still enough, if your eyes are soft and your breathing has slowed, and the last of the day has finally released its grip on your shoulders, you can almost feel it. That quiet, that ancientness, the long, slow exhale of a civilization that burned brightly for a few brief centuries and then folded itself into the earth. That is where we are going tonight. We are going north, through Greece, past the tangled olive groves and the pale limestone hillsides, past the ruined temples and the wine-dark sea, up into the region the ancient Greeks themselves sometimes viewed with a kind of wary fascination. A land of mountains and dense forests, of rivers that ran cold from snowmelt, and plains that stretched wide beneath enormous open skies. A land called Macedonia. And in that land, long ago, kings were buried.
Not buried the way most people think of burial, with a quiet ceremony and a stone marker and the slow return to routine. No, these were events. These were rituals of extraordinary complexity and intention, woven together from religious belief and political necessity, from grief that was entirely real and ceremony that was entirely calculated, from fire and gold and silence and sound. The Macedonian royal funerary tradition was one of the most elaborate, most carefully executed, most symbolically layered systems of honoring the dead that the ancient world ever produced. And for most of history, almost all of it was lost. What we knew from fragments, a line in a history written centuries after the fact, a passing mention in a letter, a description so brief it raised more questions than it answered. The actual physical evidence, the tombs themselves, the objects within them, the bones of the people placed so carefully inside, all of that remained hidden, sealed, buried under the weight of centuries and the accumulated soil of a hill in northern Greece that no one paid very much attention to for a very long time. Until one November in 1977, when a Greek archaeologist named Manolis Andronicus began removing soil from a mound near a small village called Vergina, and the ancient Macedonian world began very slowly and very quietly to speak again. Tonight, we are going to listen to what it says.
We are going to walk, gently and without hurry, through the full arc of what it meant to die as a Macedonian royal. We are going to move through the rituals of preparation, the ceremonial fires, the careful placement of golden objects in stone chambers, the long, slow processions, the sounds of mourning, and the profound architecture of belief that made all of it feel not like an ending, but like a transformation. We are going to move slowly. There is nowhere to rush to. The kings have been waiting 2,000 years. they can wait a little longer while we settle in. So let your shoulders drop. Let the tension in your jaw go soft. Feel the weight of your body where it rests, the solidity of whatever surface holds you. You have nowhere to be tonight except here, in this quiet, in this old story, in the long sleep of ancient kings. The lights of Macedonia are long extinguished, but the gold still gleams somewhere beneath the earth, and the story of how it got there is one worth hearing in the dark. Of your body where it rests, the solidity of whatever surface holds you. You have nowhere to be tonight except here, in this quiet, in this old story, in the long sleep of ancient kings. The lights of Macedonia are long extinguished, but the gold still gleams somewhere beneath the earth, and the story of how it got there is one worth hearing in the dark.
Macedonia, in its classical period, was a kingdom of contrasts. In the north and west, the land rose steeply into mountains, some of them holding snow on their peaks well into spring. The Axios River, wide and silver, cut through the central plain. To the east, the land opened towards the sea. It was a kingdom that straddled the boundary between the Greek world to the south and the wilder, less settled territories to the north. And this geographic position shaped everything about its culture, including how it thought about death and the rituals that surrounded it. Aegae was the original capital of Macedonia, the city from which the Argead dynasty, the royal family of Alexander the Great, had ruled for centuries before the capital was eventually moved to the larger and more strategically placed city of Pella. But even after Pella became the center of Macedonian political life, Aegae retained a sacred function. It was the place where kings were buried. Not a practical arrangement, not mere tradition, but something closer to a divine mandate. Ancient sources make clear that the Argeads believed their legitimacy was tied, in a spiritual and dynastic sense, to the burial of their kings in Aegae. There was a tradition, recorded by several ancient writers, that any king of Macedonia who was denied burial at Aegae would see his line end. It was not superstition so much as sacred law.
This gave the necropolis at Aegae, the city of the dead clustered around the royal capital, a weight and significance that went far beyond ordinary burial grounds. This was not simply where people went when they died. This was the place where the continuity of the kingdom was maintained. Every king interred in the sacred soil of Aegae added another link to the dynastic chain, another anchor point between the living and the dead, between the present rulers and the ancestral legitimacy they needed to claim. The site sat on a broad hill above the plain, the landscape opening wide in every direction. Mountains to the north, the slow shimmer of flat farmland to the south.
It would have been visible from a great distance, that hill, and over the centuries it accumulated the dead the way a river accumulates silt, slowly, steadily, until the landscape itself became a kind of memorial. By the time the Macedonian kingdom reached its peak, the Aegae necropolis held dozens of tombs. Most were robbed in antiquity. Ancient grave robbers were not careless or unaware. They knew that wherever kings were buried, extraordinary wealth was buried with them. And so, over the centuries, tomb after tomb was broken into, stripped, emptied. The careful arrangements of objects that had been made with such intention were scattered, the bones disturbed, the dignity of the dead undone. But not all of them.
When Manolis Andronikos and his team arrived at the site that the modern village of Vergina had grown up near, they were excavating a feature in the landscape that locals called the Great Tumulus. It was an enormous mound of earth, roughly 100 meters across and 12 meters high, an artificial hill created specifically to cover and protect what lay beneath. It had been built in antiquity, likely in the early 3rd century BCE, as a kind of protective shell, a deliberate act of concealment designed to hide the royal tombs from exactly the kind of systematic looting that had emptied so many others. The sheer volume of soil required to create it, estimated at around 60,000 cubic meters, gives some sense of the resources and the determination involved. Whoever ordered the great tumulus built wanted those tombs to remain sealed. And they did, for more than 2,000 years. When Andronikos' team began carefully removing that soil in 1977, they found not one but multiple tombs. The most significant, which they labeled Tomb 2, proved to be the most intact royal burial from the ancient Greek world ever discovered. The door had never been broken. The chamber had never been entered after its sealing in the 4th century BCE. What lay inside had been waiting in absolute darkness, undisturbed, for something like 2,300 years.
It is difficult to overstate what that means. Most of what we know about ancient burial practices comes from tombs that have been disturbed, from objects scattered or removed, from remains that have been moved or damaged. The intact nature of Tomb 2 at Vergina is what makes it so extraordinary. Here, for the first time, was a Macedonian royal burial exactly as its creators had left it. Every object in the position it was placed, every arrangement intact, every detail preserved. And what it revealed about how Macedonian kings were buried was both more elaborate and more deeply human than almost anyone had expected. It was not simply treasure placed in a hole in the ground. It was a complete cosmological statement, a carefully constructed world for the dead, built from gold and fire and intention and grief. But before we reach the tomb itself, we need to understand what happened before the body ever arrived there. Because the burial was only the final act in a long series of rituals that began at the moment of death and unfolded stage by careful stage over the days and weeks that followed. Section 3. Between Two Worlds. Macedonian Beliefs about Death and the Afterlife. To understand a funeral, you must first understand what the people performing it believed happened when someone died. Not in a vague, general sense, but specifically, concretely, with the detail that shapes actual behavior. Because the rituals of the Macedonian royal funeral were not arbitrary customs. They were practical responses to a very specific set of beliefs about what death was, where the dead went, and what the living needed to do to help them get there safely. The Macedonians, like most of the Greek world, believed that death was not an ending so much as a transition. The person who died did not simply cease to exist. They passed from one state of being into another. The body, the physical form that had walked through the world and eaten bread and ridden horses and fought in battles, that would return to the earth. But something else, something the Greeks called the psyche, a word we sometimes translate as soul, but which is perhaps better understood as the animating essence of a person, that something survived. It detached from the body at the moment of death and began a journey.
That journey led downward, into the earth, into the realm that ancient Greeks called Hades, named for its ruler, the god who presided over the dead with his queen Persephone. Hades was not, in the Greek imagination, a place of punishment in the way that later traditions might conceive of an underworld. It was simply where the dead went, a vast subterranean realm, grey and dim, populated by the shades of all who had ever died. The recently arrived would join the countless others who had come before, and they would exist there, diminished versions of their living selves, in a kind of eternal twilight. But the journey to Hades was not automatic. It required proper preparation. There were conditions that needed to be met, both by the dead themselves and by those who sent them off. The dead needed to arrive at the boundary of the underworld equipped, and the living needed to ensure that the dead could cross.
The boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead was a river, sometimes described as the Styx, sometimes as the Acheron. To cross it, the dead needed to pay the ferryman, a figure the Greeks called Charon. He was not generous or flexible. He required his payment before he would pole his boat across those dark waters. Without it, a soul might wander the near shore of the underworld for 100 years, unable to pass. This belief, widely held across the Greek world, and in Macedonia specifically, is why coins were placed with the dead. Tucked under the tongue or placed over the eyes, the coin was Charon's fare. It was practical provision for a very specific journey. Beyond the river, the dead would face judgment. In some versions of the tradition, 3 judges evaluated the life of the newly arrived soul and determined what kind of afterlife awaited. The virtuous might reach the Elysian fields, a place of extraordinary peace and beauty, where the heroic and the righteous spent eternity in something resembling contentment. The common dead went to the asphodel meadows, a kind of neutral middle ground. And those who had lived badly faced the punishments of Tartarus. But for Macedonian royalty, the aspiration was not merely virtue, it was heroization, elevation beyond the ordinary dead entirely.
This is where something distinctive about Macedonian religious culture comes in. The Argead dynasty, the royal line to which Philip II and Alexander the Great belonged, traced its lineage not merely to mortal kings, but to Heracles himself. And Heracles, the great hero of Greek myth, had famously transcended death. He had achieved a kind of divinity, becoming, after his own death and his own funeral pyre, something more than human. This mythological precedent was not decorative, it was ideological. It suggested that the royal line of Macedonia was descended from someone who had already demonstrated that the barrier between mortal and divine could be crossed. And this belief shaped the funeral.
The rituals were designed not simply to ensure that a dead king reached the underworld, but to facilitate something grander, a transformation, a movement from the realm of men into a liminal zone between human and divine, into the status of hero. A heroized king was not simply a dead ruler. He was a presence, a source of protective power for the kingdom he had left behind, an ancestor who could be called upon, whose grave could be visited, whose name could be invoked. The dead king did not disappear. He became something different.
The Orphic tradition, a mystical strand of Greek religious thought that was particularly influential in Macedonia, added further layers. Orphism placed enormous emphasis on the careful preparation of the soul for its journey, on the specific rites and words and objects that could ease or accelerate its passage. Some Orphic beliefs held that with the right preparation, the soul could bypass the dimness of ordinary Hades entirely and achieve a more radiant, more conscious form of existence. Gold tablets inscribed with instructions for the soul of the dead have been found in burial contexts across the Greek world. Tiny scripts telling the soul exactly what to say when it reached the underworld, which river to drink from, which guardians to address. Whether Macedonian royal burials included such items in their lost or destroyed forms is something archaeology cannot fully confirm. But the influence of Orphic thought on the broader ritual environment is clear.
There is one more layer to consider before we move on, and it concerns the relationship between the Macedonian tradition and the wider ancient world. Macedonia was not an isolated kingdom. It sat at a crossroads. To the south, the influence of the great Greek city-states, Athens and Thebes and Corinth and Sparta, each with their own sophisticated religious and philosophical traditions, flowed northward. To the east and northeast, the traditions of Thrace, of the steppe peoples, of the Persian Empire, exerted their own gravitational pull. The Macedonian royal court was, by the 4th century BCE, a cosmopolitan place, a gathering point for artists, philosophers, physicians, poets, and religious thinkers from across the known world. Aristotle himself spent years at the Macedonian court as Alexander's tutor, bringing with him the full weight of the Platonic intellectual tradition. The idea circulating in Philip's court about the nature of the soul, about what happened after death, about the relationship between the human and the divine, were not simple or unsophisticated. They were the product of centuries of Greek philosophical development, filtered through the particular religious culture of Macedonia, and mixed with local traditions that had their own depth and their own complexity.
The Dionysian tradition, associated with the god of wine and ecstasy and transformation, was particularly strong in Macedonia and Thrace. Dionysus was a god of dissolution and renewal, a deity who presided over the breaking down of boundaries, including the ultimate boundary between life and death. The Dionysian mysteries, like the Orphic mysteries with which they overlapped significantly, offered initiates the promise of a more conscious and more vivid afterlife, a participation in the divine that went beyond the ordinary grey dimness of Hades of popular belief. Olympias, Alexander's mother, was reportedly a devotee of ecstatic religious practices associated with Dionysus, a detail that gives us some sense of the religious atmosphere of the Macedonian royal family. All of these traditions, the Olympian cosmology of Hades and Charon and the underworld, the Homeric ideal of heroization and the eternal life of the honored dead, the Orphic promise of conscious transcendence, the Dionysian embrace of dissolution and renewal, flowed together in the context of the royal funeral. The people who organized these ceremonies were not drawing from a single simple belief system. They were working within a rich and layered religious world where multiple frameworks coexisted and where the boundaries between them were permeable and productive.
What all of this means, practically, is that the people who organized a Macedonian royal funeral were operating with a very detailed understanding of what was at stake. The dead king was on a journey. He needed to be equipped. He needed to be honored. He needed to be sent off in a way that reflected his status, because status in life had direct implications for the quality of the afterlife. A king buried as a hero would arrive in the next world as a hero. A king buried poorly, or worse, not buried at all, might wander and suffer. The elaborate rituals that followed death were not empty ceremony. They were purposeful, urgent, and in the minds of those who performed them, genuinely consequential. And so, from the very moment a Macedonian king drew his last breath, a complex and carefully sequenced process began to unfold. Section 4. The prothesis, preparing the royal body. The first stage of the Macedonian royal funeral was called the prothesis. The word itself comes from the Greek for setting out or laying before, and that is precisely what it was, the setting out of the body. The preparation, display, and formal acknowledgement of the dead before the larger rituals of departure could begin. It started with the body itself.
When a king died, or a queen, or any member of the royal household whose rank demanded the full ceremonial treatment, the first people to attend to the body were women. This was not incidental. It was prescribed. The washing and preparation of the dead was, in the Greek world broadly, and in Macedonia specifically, primarily the domain of women, particularly female relatives and trusted servants of the household. There was a long tradition, visible in Homer, visible in the funeral rites of the wider Greek world, and evident in Macedonian practice, of women as the primary custodians of the dead in these first intimate hours after death. The body would be carried to a chamber, likely within the palace, and laid out on a raised surface. Then began the careful process of preparation. The body was washed, thoroughly and reverently, with clean water. This washing was not merely hygienic, it was ritual purification, the cleansing of the body before its transformation, the removal of the traces of ordinary life before the extraordinary rite of passage that was to come. The water used might have been infused with aromatic substances, herbs or oils that carried their own significance. The act of washing was deliberate, careful, unhurried. After washing came the anointing. Aromatic oils, among the most precious substances in the ancient world, were poured over the body with care. The fragrance of these oils was meaningful on several levels. Practically, it helped preserve the body and mask the signs of decay that would inevitably begin. Ritually, the use of precious scented oils was a marker of status and honor. To anoint a body with high-quality oil was to make a statement about the value placed on that person. Kings and queens received the most expensive preparations available. The scent of cedar, of myrrh, of sweet olive oil would have hung in the chamber during the prothesis, mixing with the smoke of oil lamps and the cooler air of stone walls. The body was then dressed. This too was deeply significant.
Macedonian royalty was dressed not in the plain linen wrapping of ordinary burial, but in fine garments, robes appropriate to their status, fabrics that reflected the wealth and prestige of the royal household. The colour purple, Tyrian purple, extracted at enormous expense from the murex sea snail, was a royal colour, and evidence from the Vergina tombs suggests that purple cloth was used in the wrapping and covering of royal remains. At Tomb 2, traces of purple fabric were found, remnants of the cloth in which the bones had been bundled before being placed in the golden chest. Even in death, the royal colour endured.
The body was adorned. Jewelry was placed. Wreaths, among the most symbolically loaded objects in the Greek world, were set upon the head or placed nearby. The wreath carried layers of meaning. It was an honor, the ancient equivalent of a crown in certain contexts, but it also had religious connotations, connecting the wearer to the divine or to heroic status. For a king, the wreath at death was not decoration, it was a declaration. It said, this person was more than ordinary. This person leaves the world as someone elevated. The face merited particular attention. Across the Greek world, there was a tradition of placing something over the face of the dead, sometimes a cloth, sometimes in more elaborate contexts, a kind of mask. At Vergina, the evidence suggests an unusually sophisticated approach to the face of the dead king. In one of the tombs, researchers found traces of what appeared to be a ceremonial treatment of the bones of the skull area using rare minerals, huntite among them, a white mineral of unusual purity, layered in a way suggestive of deliberate ritual application. The idea of a posthumous face covering, even a kind of death mask recalling the famous gold masks of Mycenae centuries earlier, has been seriously considered by scholars examining the Vergina remains.
A coin or coins were placed with the body, often associated with the mouth or the eyes. Charon's fare, the toll for the crossing. Small bronze or silver coins carefully positioned, making certain the soul would have what it needed for the very first moment of its journey. This detail, so easy to pass over when reading about ancient burials, carries extraordinary weight when you consider what it meant to those who did it. They genuinely believed the coin would be needed. They genuinely believed there was a ferryman waiting somewhere in the darkness who would not carry a soul across without it. The act of placing a coin was not symbolic. It was practical provision for a journey they absolutely expected would take place. Once the body was prepared, it was laid out for what we might call lying in state. The prothesis in its fullest form was a public display, a period during which members of the household, the nobility, the army could come and pay their respects. For a king, this was not merely personal grief, it was political performance. The court needed to acknowledge the death, to witness it, to begin the collective process of mourning that would eventually give way to the collective process of transition. The body lay surrounded by offerings, by flowers where they were available, by lamps that burned through the night, by the quiet attendance of those designated to sit with the dead and ensure the body was not left alone.
Mourning during the prothesis was vocal. This is important to understand because modern funerary culture in many parts of the world tends toward quiet, toward restraint, toward the contained expression of grief. The ancient Macedonian tradition, like much of the ancient Greek world, was the opposite. Women mourned loudly, they wailed, they tore at their hair, at their garments, they beat their chests. This was not considered undignified, it was expected, It was the appropriate response to the loss of someone important. The sound of lamentation filled the palace during the prothesis, rising and falling with the waves of grief that moved through those present. Professional mourners, women skilled in the art of lamentation, might be hired to supplement the mourning of the household, their practiced voices amplifying the collective expression of loss. The duration of the prothesis varied. For an ordinary person, it might last a day. For a king, it extended longer, enough time for news to travel, for important figures from across the kingdom to make the journey, to pay their respects, for the proper ceremonial preparations to be assembled and made ready. During this time, the body was attended continuously, the lamps never went out, the vigil never broke. And then, when the prothesis was complete, when the body had been properly honored in its lying state, the next stage began. The movement, the procession, the long solemn journey from palace to the place of transformation.
There is something hypnotic about fire, something that reaches past language and logic and touches something older in us. The ancient Macedonians understood this. Fire for them was not merely a practical tool, it was an agent of transformation, a sacred force that moved things from one state of being into another. And in the context of the royal funeral, fire was the central instrument of the entire proceeding. Elite Macedonian burials in the 4th century BCE practiced cremation. This was not universal across all of Macedonia at all times. Earlier periods show evidence of inhumation, the burial of the intact body, and the practice shifted and changed over the long span of Macedonian history. But for the royal burials of the classical and early Hellenistic period, the period of Philip II and Alexander the Great, cremation on an elaborate pyre was the expected and honored method. And the influence of Homer on this choice is direct and unmistakable.
Homer was not simply literature in the ancient world. He was something closer to sacred text. The Iliad and the Odyssey were the foundational cultural documents of the Greek world, and in Macedonia, where the royal court maintained a deep and genuine connection to Homeric tradition, they were taken as models. Alexander the Great famously slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, annotated by his tutor, Aristotle. The heroes of Homer were not distant fiction to the Macedonians. They were ancestral templates. And in Homer, the great heroes were cremated on elaborate pyres. The funeral of Patroclus in the Iliad is one of the most detailed and emotionally weighted passages in all of ancient literature. Patroclus, the beloved companion of Achilles, is killed in battle, and Achilles' grief is boundless, his mourning volcanic. The funeral pyre built for Patroclus is described with care. The cutting of wood, the construction of the pyre, the sacrificial animals, the participation of the army. And when the pyre is lit, it burns through the night, Achilles tending it, keeping the flames high out of love and grief and desperate honor. The bones of Patroclus are collected afterward, wrapped carefully, placed in a golden vessel, waiting for the day when Achilles himself would join them.
This image, the golden vessel holding the cremated bones of the hero, the pyre as both cremation and apotheosis, would become the literal blueprint for Macedonian royal burial practice. The resemblance between the Homeric description and what was found in Tomb 2 at Vergina is not coincidence, it is deliberate. The people who organized Philip II's funeral were consciously reenacting and, in their minds, fulfilling a Homeric ideal. They were placing their king in the company of heroes, giving him a funeral worthy of Patroclus, worthy of Achilles himself. The construction of the funeral pyre for a Macedonian king would have been an enormous undertaking. Wood needed to be gathered in quantity, good wood, dry wood, wood that would burn intensely and completely. The pyre was not a simple bonfire. It was a structure built with intention, high enough to be seen, large enough to hold not only the body, but the objects, the offerings, the grave goods that would accompany the king into the fire. Animals were sacrificed and their bodies placed on the pyre. Horses, dogs, hunting equipment, weapons, all of these went into the fire with the king. The purpose was twofold. These things were offerings to the gods, and they were provisions for the dead in the next world.
The lighting of the pyre was ceremonial, likely performed by a senior member of the royal family or the court, and conducted with religious solemnity. When the flames caught and began to climb, the assembled mourners would have been gathered around it. The army, in the case of a king who was also a military leader, would have stood in formation. The fire would have been maintained throughout its burning, kept high, kept hot, the intention being a clean and complete cremation that transformed the body entirely rather than partially consuming it. The burning took time, hours certainly, possibly the better part of a day or through a night, the flames reflecting in the faces of those who kept the vigil. The sound of a large pyre burning is not quiet. It roars, it crackles, it pops and shifts as the structure within it collapses. The smell carries a long distance. For those in attendance, the experience of standing around the royal pyre as it burned was saturated with sensory intensity, with heat on the face and the smell of sacred smoke, and the sound of lamentation rising from the mourners.
There is another dimension to the pyre that is easy to overlook in the focus on the physical. The pyre was a public act. It was witnessed. In the case of a royal funeral, it would have been witnessed by enormous numbers of people. The fire was a shared experience. It gathered people around a common center, a common heat, a common light against the darkness. The grief of the individual mourners was real and private and could never be fully communicated. But the fire was shared. Everyone standing around it was standing around the same thing, watching the same transformation, breathing the same smoke.
There is something in that sharing that the Macedonian ritual understood and that we would do well to appreciate. The communal witnessing of the pyre was not simply a practical necessity. It was part of the ceremony's function. The dead king needed to be seen departing. The kingdom needed to acknowledge the departure. The succession needed to be marked, not just in political terms, but in experiential, bodily terms, as something the people present had witnessed with their own eyes, felt with their own skin, smelled in the air around them. Grief that is witnessed by a community becomes part of the community. The shared experience of the pyre bound the survivors together, made them all participants in the same event, the same turning of the world, the same moment when one king became the past and another became the future.
When the fire finally went out, when the last of the flames subsided and the coals dimmed to grey and cooling ash, the real work began. The remains of the pyre needed to be searched carefully. The bones of the king, now calcined by the intense heat, bleached white and brittle, needed to be collected. This was done with care and reverence, the bone fragments gathered by hand or with implements, perhaps using wine to quench the remaining heat and to purify what was found. The bones would have been separated as much as possible from the ash and the debris of everything else that had burned on the pyre. Not every fragment could be recovered, but the intention was as complete a collection as possible. Some of the brave goods that had been on the pyre were also recovered from the ash. At Tomb 2 in Vergina, items found on the roof of the structure above the burial chamber, the place where the pyre debris had been deposited, included fragments of ivory from a decorated shield, pieces of burned objects that had accompanied the king into the fire. These fragments, blackened and heat-damaged, still spoke clearly of what they had once been. And then the bones were washed.
This ritual, the washing of the cremated remains before their final placement, is described in Homer and is evident in the Vergina material. The calcined bones were cleaned, purified, ritually prepared for their final resting place. They were then wrapped, likely in the purple cloth whose traces have been found, bundled with care and reverence, and placed inside the object that would hold them for eternity. A golden chest. Section 6. The gold larnax, a king's bones at rest. The larnax is a word that does not translate perfectly into English. It refers to a small chest or box used in ancient Macedonia and the broader Greek world as a container for the remains of the dead. In their humblest form, larnaces could be made of terracotta or lead, simple containers without particular distinction. But in the Macedonian royal context, the larnax was elevated into something extraordinary, an object of such beauty and significance that it stands today as one of the most recognizable artifacts of the ancient world.
The gold larnax found in Tomb 2 at Vergina is approximately 40 centimeters long, 27 centimeters wide, and 17 centimeters high. It is made of gold, pure and gleaming, and its surface is decorated with a pattern of acanthus leaves and flowers worked in fine relief. But it is the lid that commands the most attention. On the lid, worked in the same gold, is a 16-pointed star, a sunburst with rays extending outward in every direction, sometimes called the Vergina star, sometimes the Star of Argead, the symbol of the royal dynasty. It is immediately striking, visually arresting even in photographs, and in person, in the museum at Vergina where it is now displayed, it reportedly stops people in their tracks. Inside this chest, inside this star-crowned golden box, lay the cremated bones of a Macedonian king. They were wrapped in purple and gold cloth before being placed inside. The fragments of fabric that survived, preserved by the dry conditions of the sealed chamber, still showed the purple dye, still retained something of their original structure. The bones themselves were carefully arranged, not scattered carelessly but laid with intention, the skull fragments towards one end, the long bones of the limbs placed along the length of the chest, a deliberate ordering that reflected the care taken in their collection and placement.
On top of the bones, inside the chest before it was sealed, a wreath was placed, a golden wreath made from gold that had been worked into the forms of oak leaves and acorns, delicate and intricate, the finest example of ancient goldsmithing that a royal workshop could produce. The Macedonian gold wreath is not a decoration in the way we might think of a crown or a circlet. It is a profound symbol layered with religious and cultural meaning. The oak was associated with Zeus, the king of the gods. The wreath of oak leaves was a sign of the highest honor, divine connection, royal authority. To place such a wreath with the bones of the dead king was to send him into eternity crowned, honored, divine in aspiration, if not in literal fact. The weight of that wreath, the cool solidity of gold shaped into leaves by hands that would have trembled slightly with the weight of the task, the careful lowering of it onto the bones before the lid was closed, these are the details that carry the human reality of the moment. Someone did this. A specific person with specific hands on a specific day in the 4th century BCE performed this act. They placed the wreath. They closed the lid. They sealed the chest. And then, for over 2,000 years, the golden box sat in its chamber in absolute darkness, the bones inside slowly shifting as the centuries passed, the oak leaves of the wreath lying undisturbed, waiting. The larnax was then placed in the stone chamber of the tomb. In Tomb 2, it was placed in the main burial chamber, on a marble slab or possibly within a marble sarcophagus, surrounded by the other grave goods that had been carefully arranged in preparation for the king's eternal life. The golden chest was the heart of the burial, the physical center of everything, the object around which all the other objects were organized, and the space itself was designed. The smaller golden larnax found in the antechamber, the outer room of Tomb 2, held a second set of cremated remains, also wrapped in purple cloth, and also accompanied by a gold wreath, though this one was made of myrtle rather than oak. The human remains in the antechamber larnax are those of a woman, and the story of who she was, what her life contained, and why she was buried in such proximity to the king in the main chamber, is one of the most fascinating and contested questions that the Vergina excavation has raised. But we will return to her in a moment. First, let us consider the larnax itself as an object of meditation. There is something about the idea of a golden box that holds the bones of a king, placed in the darkness of a sealed stone chamber for 2,000 years, that reaches past historical analysis and into something quieter and more personal. Kings are usually understood in terms of their actions, their campaigns, their conquests, their decisions. Philip II of Macedonia reorganized an army, defeated the Greek city-states at Chaeronea in 338 BCE, created the most powerful military force the Mediterranean world had yet seen. He was brilliant, ruthless, endlessly strategic. And then he died. And someone washed his bones and wrapped them in purple cloth and put them in a gold box and closed the lid. That reduction from the full blazing complexity of a human life to the small quiet weight of bones in a golden chest is not a diminishment. It is, in its own way, a kind of truth. The larnax says, this person was real, this person existed. Whatever else they were a body that returned to the elements, tended and honored and carried forward in memory by those who loved them or depended on them or feared them. The golden box is a vessel not just for bones, but for everything a life accumulates, everything it leaves behind. Section 7. Tomb Architecture, the House of Eternity. The golden larnax did not sit in an empty hole in the ground. It sat in a house a house built for the dead, designed with care and decorated with artistry, a permanent dwelling built to the same standards of craftsmanship as any building meant to endure. The Macedonian royal tomb was architecture in the fullest sense of the word, and understanding its design helps us understand what the people who built it believed about the life that continued after death.
The barrel-vaulted Macedonian tomb is one of the distinctive architectural forms of the Hellenistic world. The vault, a curved arch of carefully cut stone that springs from the walls and meets at the crown in a smooth, continuous curve, was not an innovation that the Greeks had used widely in earlier centuries. Earlier Greek buildings used horizontal stone beams to span openings. The vault was something newer, something the Macedonian builders adopted and developed to remarkable effect in their tomb architecture, and its use in the royal burials at Vergina produces chambers of extraordinary solidity and presence. Tomb 2 at Vergina consists of 2 chambers. The outer chamber, called the antechamber, is accessed through a doorway at the front of the structure. The main burial chamber is behind it, connected by an interior doorway. The 2 rooms together create a kind of domestic arrangement, a house with a main room and an adjoining space, a parallel to the living arrangements of the palace, the world of the living translated into stone for the use of the dead.
The construction of these tombs began before the death of the person to be buried, or at least was completed rapidly after it. The walls were built from large cut stone blocks fitted with precision. The vault was constructed over a timber framework that was removed once the stone had set. The floor was paved, and the facade, the exterior face of the tomb, visible before it was covered with the tumulus, was decorated. The facade of Tomb 2 at Vergina features a remarkable painted frieze above the doorway. This is one of the most important works of ancient Greek painting to have survived, because ancient Greek painting, which was once as celebrated in the ancient world as ancient sculpture, is almost entirely lost. What remains of it is fragmentary and often in poor condition. The Vergina frieze, protected by the darkness and the sealed conditions of the tomb, has survived in a state that allows us to understand something of the quality and style of Royal Macedonian painting at its height.
The frieze depicts a hunt, a royal hunt. On horseback and on foot, a group of figures pursues a lion, deer, and other animals through a landscape suggested by spare, elegant lines. The figures are dynamic, energetic, moving across the painted space with a confidence of draftsmanship that speaks to a master craftsman working at the height of their skill. Among the hunters, scholars have identified figures that may represent Philip II himself, and possibly the young Alexander, though these identifications remain debated. The choice of the hunt as the subject for the tomb's primary painted decoration is not accidental. The hunt was central to Macedonian aristocratic culture. It was a marker of nobility, a test of courage and skill, and a ritual activity with religious dimensions. Hunting the lion, in particular, carried connotations of royal power and divine favor that reached back into the deepest layers of ancient Near Eastern symbolism. The king who hunted the lion was demonstrating his mastery over the wildest and most dangerous of creatures, asserting his dominion over the untamed world. To paint a hunt on the facade of the royal tomb was to declare in permanent visual form what kind of man lay within.
Inside the chambers, the walls were also plastered and painted. though the interior paintings are less well preserved than the exterior frieze. The quality of the plasterwork is impressive, smooth and carefully prepared, the kind of surface a skilled painter would demand. The chambers were not raw stone, they were finished spaces, dressed and decorated, the walls prepared as carefully as the walls of a palace room. The dimensions of the chambers are not enormous by modern standards. The main chamber of Tomb 2 is approximately 3.5 meters wide and roughly the same in depth. The vault rises above, the curved ceiling creating a sense of contained but dignified space. It is not a room in which you would feel cramped, but it is intimate rather than grand, a personal space rather than a public one. This is interesting because it suggests that the tomb was conceived as a private dwelling for the dead king rather than as a monument designed to impress visitors, since visitors were never intended to enter once the tomb was sealed.
The doorway between the antechamber and the main chamber was closed with a marble door, fitted with precision and sealed. The outer entrance of the tomb, facing the world, was also closed and sealed before the mound of earth was piled over everything. The tomb was not meant to be reopened. It was not a mausoleum in the later sense, a building intended for continued visitation and veneration. It was sealed, closed, completed, and then buried. The house of eternity was not for the living to visit. It was for the dead to inhabit undisturbed in perpetuity. The effort required to build such a structure under the time pressure of a royal funeral speaks to the resources of the Macedonian royal court and to the priority placed on providing the king with a proper eternal home. Hundreds of workers would have been involved: stonemasons, plasterers, painters, carpenters, labourers, hauling and placing the enormous stone blocks. All of this happening while the body of the king was being prepared, while the rituals of mourning were being observed, while the political machinery of succession was grinding into motion. The tomb was built in the midst of grief, in the urgency of transition, and yet it was built with extraordinary care, because the dead king deserved no less. Section 8. Grave goods and a language of objects.
If the architecture of the tomb was a statement, the objects placed within it were a conversation. Each item chosen for the burial, each weapon laid down, each vessel set in place, each piece of jewelry arranged with care, was a word in a long and complex sentence about who this person had been and what they were going to need. The grave goods in Macedonian royal tombs are staggering in their quality, variety, and symbolic density. What Andronachus found in Tomb 2 at Vergina, scattered across the floors of the two chambers and arranged around the central golden larnax, constitutes the finest collection of royal burial objects from the classical Greek world. Let us move through them slowly, the way you might move through a room by lamplight, pausing at each object to consider what it is saying.
Weapons. There are weapons in the tomb. Iron weapons, carefully made. The marks of actual use visible on some of them. Evidence that these were not ceremonial objects created purely for the burial, but tools of real violence that had seen real service. Spearheads, sword fittings, arrowheads. A royal warrior was buried ready for whatever conflicts might arise in the next world, armed the way he had been armed in this one. The presence of these objects does not suggest that the Macedonians literally expected their dead king to be fighting battles in the underworld. It is more subtle than that. The weapons identify the dead man. They say what he was: a warrior, a king, a man who commanded armies and led charges. To be buried without weapons would be to be buried as something he was not.
Armor. The ceremonial aspects of the armor found at Vergina suggest it occupied a different category from the functional weapons. An iron helmet, Chalcidian in style, was found in the tomb. More dramatically, evidence of an elaborate iron and gold panoply, a suit of armor, was discovered. The iron largely corroded, but the gold fittings surviving. And most remarkable of all, fragments of an ivory-decorated ceremonial shield, a somphos in the Greek terminology, a shield so elaborately decorated with ivory carvings of figures in combat that it could never have been intended as functional battlefield equipment. It was art, it was statement, a shield that said this person was great enough to carry a work of art into battle, or at least into eternity.
Jewelry, gold rings, gold pins, items of personal adornment that speak of daily intimacy, the objects worn against the skin, the items that people reach for each morning. Their presence in the tomb anchors the burial in the personal rather than the merely royal. Whoever this person was, they wore these things. These small objects touched them. The silver and bronze vessels deserve special attention for what they represent in terms of craft. The metalworking traditions visible in the Vergina objects represent the absolute peak of what ancient workshops could achieve in the 4th century BCE. The proportions of the vessels are elegant, the surfaces beautifully finished, the decorative elements applied with precision. These were not objects hastily made for a burial. They were, in many cases, objects that had been used, that had been part of the living royal household, that were now sent with the dead king as a continuation of the life he had lived, rather than a substitute or imitation of it.
And then there is the most peculiar and moving category of grave good, the personal items, the things that were specific not to royalty in general, but to this specific person. The greaves, the lower leg armor found in Tomb 2, were asymmetrical in a way that caught researchers' attention. One greave is slightly shorter and differently shaped than the other, consistent with someone who had a leg injury, a shorter limb, a healed wound that had changed the way the leg sat. This asymmetry, tiny and specific, a small note in a large symphony of objects, spoke directly to the individuality of the person buried. It said, "This is a specific body. This is a specific man with a specific history. Not just a king in the abstract, but this king, the one with the injured leg." Philip II of Macedonia had a famous leg wound. Ancient sources describe it. He walked with a limp. The asymmetric greaves, discovered in the darkness of a sealed tomb, are physical evidence of a historical fact that had been preserved only in written records for over 2,000 years. They represent one of those moments in archaeology when the object and the text come together in a way that produces something close to certainty, or at least to a profound and moving proximity.
One further category of grave goods deserves mention, and it is one that does not survive in visible form, but whose presence can be inferred: food and drink. The ancient Macedonians, like virtually every culture that has ever buried its dead with any degree of ceremony, placed food and drink in the tomb. Not because they believed the dead would literally sit down and eat a meal, but because provision and abundance were expressions of honor, and because the transition to the next world was conceived as a journey that might require sustenance. Traces of organic material in Macedonian burial contexts, the residues in bronze vessels, the remains of animal bones from sacrificial offerings, suggest that wine, oil, grain, and meat were placed with the dead as a final act of hospitality from the living world. There is something in this that reaches past all the gold and the philosophy and the elaborate cosmological architecture of the Macedonian funerary tradition and arrives at something very simple and very human. Someone is leaving, and before they go, you give them something to eat. You make sure they are provided for. You do not want them to be hungry on the road. This impulse, as ancient as human culture itself, expressed through the most magnificent materials the Macedonian royal court could command, is at the heart of everything. The objects in Tomb 2 do not simply mark a grave, they construct a portrait. A warrior who was also a sophisticate, a king who appreciated beautiful things, a man who had been wounded in battle and parried that wound in his body for the rest of his life, a person who drank and feasted and hunted and thought about the gods. Each object adds a line, and together they produce not a complete picture, nothing so neat, but something far better, the suggestion of a real person, complicated and specific, who lived and died in a particular place at a particular time, and was placed in the earth by people who knew and honored him. Section 9. Philip II, the king who was buried in fire and gold. He was born in 382 BCE, the third son of a king named Amyntas III. His early life was not easy or stable. He spent a period of his youth as a political hostage in Thebes, in the household of the Theban general Epaminondas, one of the greatest military minds of the ancient world. This was not the comfortable captivity of later diplomatic practice. It was real constraint, real danger, and real education. The young Philip watched Epaminondas think about warfare, observed the deep tactical philosophy that had made the Theban army unbeatable, absorbed everything he could. He returned to Macedonia a different person. He returned with ideas. When he came to power in 359 BCE, Macedonia was in crisis. The kingdom had suffered military defeats, internal divisions, threats on multiple frontiers. Philip took the situation and, with a combination of military genius, diplomatic skill, and what we might politely call willingness to use any means necessary to achieve his goals, remade it. He reformed the Macedonian army, introducing innovations in formation and weapons use that made it the most formidable fighting force in the Mediterranean.
He expanded the kingdom in every direction. He manipulated, bribed, threatened, and, when necessary, destroyed the political structures of the southern Greek city-states, until Macedonia stood as the unchallenged dominant power of the Greek world.
And then, in 336 BCE, at a celebration in the theatre at Aegae, at what should have been a moment of supreme triumph, Philip II was assassinated. A young Macedonian nobleman named Pausanias approached him and drove a dagger into him. Philip died quickly. He was 46 years old. His death threw the Macedonian court into crisis. The succession was not straightforward. There were rival claimants, plots in motion, dangers on every side. The new king, the 20-year-old Alexander, needed to move fast politically. But first, the king who had created the kingdom that Alexander was inheriting needed to be buried, and buried properly. The funeral of Philip II was by all indications a full royal Macedonian ceremony. The prophesis, the preparation and display of the body, the construction and lighting of the funeral pyre, the careful collection of the burned bones, the washing and wrapping and placement in the golden chest, all of it conducted with the full resources of the most powerful court in the Greek world.
What the forensic study of the remains in Tomb 2 has revealed about Philip, or at least about whoever was buried there, is remarkable. The skull bones show evidence of a significant healed wound around the right eye socket, consistent with what ancient sources tell us about Philip having lost the sight of one eye to an arrow while on campaign, the arrow of a Methonian archer striking him during the siege of Methone in 354 BCE. The injury described in the ancient texts and the healed bone damage visible under forensic examination align in a way that has convinced many researchers that the identification of the tomb as Philip's is correct. The leg wound is also visible in the form of the asymmetric greaves already mentioned, and in some analyses of the bone fragments themselves, which show evidence of healed fracture damage consistent with a significant leg injury. Philip's limp was famous in antiquity. It seems to have been famous still in the 4th century BCE to the craftsmen who made his burial armor. They made the left greave shorter than the right. They accommodated the dead king's body in his burial equipment, as they had presumably accommodated it in his living equipment for years.
In the antechamber of Tomb 2, the smaller golden larnax contained the remains of a woman, and those remains, studied by forensic anthropologists using techniques not available to Andronakis in the 1970s, have revealed something extraordinary. The woman's bones show evidence of a healed lower leg injury that produced a shortening of the limb, consistent with a fracture that had healed imperfectly. This injury, combined with analysis of bone fusion patterns suggesting she was relatively young at death, in her late 30s or early 40s, and combined with the presence of a quiver full of arrows among her grave goods, a hunting and possibly martial implement, has led some researchers to suggest she was a woman warrior, possibly someone from the Scythian or similar nomadic traditions to the north and east, who had been incorporated into the Macedonian court. Who she was specifically remains debated. Some scholars argue she may have been Cleopatra, Philip's last Macedonian wife. Others propose a different identification entirely. But her presence in the antechamber, buried with her own golden larnax and her own wreath, armed with her own quiver, speaks to a funerary tradition that extended significant honor to the women of the royal household, even in death. She was not an afterthought. She was a presence, a named and intentional burial, placed beside the king with as much care as the king himself had received. The gold oak reef found inside Philip's larnax, resting on his bones, deserves a moment of careful attention. It is made from gold beaten into thin sheets and then worked into the forms of leaves and acorns, each leaf attached to a branching wire structure with the delicacy of real plant matter. There are hundreds of individual leaves. The craftsmanship is breathtaking, producing a thing of extraordinary natural lightness from a material that is inherently heavy. Looking at it, even in photographs, produces a sensation that is hard to articulate. It is too delicate for its material. It should not be possible. And yet someone made it, specifically for this king, specifically for this moment of burial. It was placed on his bones, and it has sat there, motionless in the dark, for over 2,000 years. Section 10. Hephaestion's pyre, the most expensive funeral in history. If the funeral of Philip II represents the full Macedonian royal tradition as it existed at the peak of its development, the funeral of Hephaestion represents something else entirely, something that exceeded all precedent, that pushed the boundaries of what a funeral could be, that transformed a ceremony of mourning into an act of staggering, almost incomprehensible grandeur.
Hephaestion was Alexander the Great's closest companion. The two had known each other since childhood, had trained together under Aristotle at the school at Mieza, had ridden together in every campaign of Alexander's extraordinary career. The nature of their relationship has been debated by historians for centuries. Ancient sources describe it in terms that suggest an emotional bond of the deepest kind, comparing it explicitly to the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. Whether that relationship was romantic in a physical sense is a question that the ancient sources leave tantalizingly ambiguous. What is clear is that Hephaestion was, by any measure, the person Alexander loved most in the world. In the autumn of 324 BCE, during a period of celebration and games at Ecbatana, the great city in the Median highlands, Hephaestion fell ill. The illness was rapid and severe, a fever that progressed with terrifying speed. Alexander's personal physician, a man named Glaucius, was treating him, but the treatment was either inadequate or unable to stop the progression of the disease. Ancient sources suggest that Hephaestion, feeling better at one point, ignored medical advice and ate a large meal and drank wine, which may have contributed to his collapse. Whatever the cause, by the time Alexander was summoned from the games, Hephaestion was dying. He was dead before Alexander arrived. What followed was one of the most elaborately documented expressions of royal grief in the ancient world.
Alexander's initial response was personal, physical, overwhelming. He threw himself on the body of his dead companion and wept. He lay beside the corpse for a day and a half, refusing to be moved. His generals and companions had to forcibly separate him from the body. When he finally rose, his first act was to order the execution of the physician who had failed to save Hephaestion. His second was to order every sacred flame in the empire extinguished in mourning, a Persian practice of marking the death of a great king that Alexander now extended to honor his friend. He cut his own hair short. This gesture, drawn directly from Homer, was the echo of Achilles cutting his hair as a final offering to the dead Patroclus. Alexander was not performing sentiment, he was performing Homeric ritual, consciously placing himself and his grief within the framework of the greatest lament in Greek literature. He sent to the oracle at Siwa in Egypt, asking that Hephaestion be honored as a god. The oracle's reported response was that he could be honored as a hero,
a divine figure of lesser but still extraordinary status, somewhere between mortal and divine.
The body was mummified, a technique drawn from Egyptian practice and transported by processional from Ecbatana to Babylon. The procession itself was an act of public mourning on a grand scale, the body in a gilded coffin surrounded by offerings and military honor guards, moving slowly westward across the landscape of the empire. When it arrived in Babylon, the full extent of what Alexander intended became clear. He commissioned a funeral pyre. Not a pyre in the ordinary sense, a structure, an architectural monument to grief so enormous that the account of it, preserved in the ancient historian Diodorus, reads more like the description of a building than a bonfire. The architect, a man named Stachycrates, received a commission that had no precedent in human history. The pyre was a square structure 60 meters high, built in stepped levels that rose one above the other like a ziggurat. Each level was decorated with a different elaborate program of sculpture and imagery. The first level featured warships, their prows gilded and armed with statues. The second level carried enormous torches with snake decorations at the base and golden wreaths around their middles. The third level showed a hunting scene rendered in sculpture and relief, the royal hunt that was so central to Macedonian identity. The fourth level depicted a battle of centaurs, again in gold. The fifth level showed lions and bulls. The sixth displayed the arms of Macedonia and Persia together.
Between the levels, at intervals, stood hollow statues of sirens, mythological figures with voices so beautiful they could stop the living in their tracks. Inside these hollow statues, hidden from sight, real singers had been placed. When the ceremony began and the mourners were assembled, and the body of Hephaestion lay on its bier at the center of this extraordinary structure, the singers inside the sirens began to sing. Their voices came from the mouths of statues, as if the figures themselves were lamenting. The blend of voice and artifice, of human grief and theatrical illusion, was designed to produce an experience that was overwhelming, that transported the mourners beyond ordinary reality into something more vast, more mythological. The cost was enormous. Ancient sources put Alexander's own contribution at 10,000 talents of silver. Additional contributions from friends, nobles, diplomats, and the people of Babylon brought the total to something approaching 12,000 talents. To put this in some perspective, 10,000 talents was roughly the annual revenue of the entire Persian Empire before Alexander's conquest. It was not merely expensive, it was an act of deliberate excess, a declaration that no amount of wealth was sufficient to honor what had been lost, that money itself was an inadequate measure of grief.
When the pyre was lit, the fire that consumed it was visible from an enormous distance. The structure burned through the day and into the night, and when it was over, when the 60-meter monument of grief had collapsed into ash and ember, the remains were collected and prepared for burial with the same care that would have been given to a king. Hephaestion was buried at Babylon. His tomb, like much of Babylon, is lost, but the record of his funeral survives, and it is one of the most extraordinary documents of human grief and human extravagance that antiquity has left us. It is a window into what Alexander the Great looked like when he loved something and lost it.
and it is, in its way, the fullest possible expression of everything the Macedonian funerary tradition aspired to: the transformation of loss into spectacle, of grief into grandeur, of a human death into something that approached the mythological. Section 11. Alexander's own funeral, a body that defied tradition.
And then, barely a year after Hephaestion's death, Alexander himself died. The irony has a weight that even the most detached historical observer cannot quite escape. The man who had planned and commissioned the most extravagant funeral in history, who had mourned his closest friend with the full resources of the greatest empire the ancient world had yet seen, did not receive a comparable ceremony. His own death produced chaos rather than ceremony, political crisis rather than ritual order, years of dispute rather than a swift and dignified resolution. Alexander the Great died in Babylon on the 10th or 11th of June, 323 BCE. He was 32 years old. The cause of death is disputed by modern scholars. Ancient sources describe a fever following a drinking party, a prolonged illness that went from serious to fatal over roughly 10 days. Various theories have been proposed by modern researchers, from typhoid fever to poisoning, to complications from alcoholism, to some combination of factors that a 32-year-old body that had been through years of extraordinary physical stress simply could not overcome. Whatever the cause, the death was real. What followed was not. After Alexander died, his body was not immediately prepared for burial in the normal way. The ancient historian Plutarch describes a remarkable phenomenon. The body of Alexander showed no signs of decomposition for several days, remaining apparently unchanged in the summer heat of Babylon. This preservation was interpreted by those present as a divine sign, evidence that Alexander was not entirely mortal, that something sacred protected his body in a way that ordinary bodies were not protected. The political situation made organized mourning nearly impossible. Alexander had died without clearly designating an heir. His generals, who would become the rulers of the Hellenistic kingdoms that divided his empire in the decades following his death, were locked in immediate and vicious competition for power and territory. The question of what happened to Alexander's body was inseparable from the question of who would control his legacy. Perdiccas, who initially controlled the body, planned to transport it to Macedonia for burial at Aegae, in accordance with the ancestral tradition that demanded Macedonian kings be interred there. The funeral cart constructed for this journey was described in ancient sources as a vehicle of extraordinary elaboration, a gilded platform with a vaulted roof supported by Ionic columns, decorated with paintings and gold and precious materials, attended by armed guards and drawn by 64 mules selected for their strength and matched appearance. The body lay inside in a golden sarcophagus, embalmed, preserved, dressed in the royal Macedonian way. But the body never reached Macedonia. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals who had secured Egypt as his domain, intercepted the funeral procession. He diverted Alexander's body to Egypt. His reasons were both personal and political. He had his own genuine devotion to Alexander, having served as one of his closest companions and trusted generals for years. But he also understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had learned statecraft at the feet of the greatest ruler of the age, that possession of Alexander's body was possession of legitimacy. Whoever controlled Alexander's tomb controlled the most powerful symbol in the Hellenistic world. Alexander was first buried in Memphis, the ancient Egyptian capital. Later, his body was moved to Alexandria, the city he had founded on the Egyptian coast, where a magnificent tomb was constructed. The Sema, as this tomb was called, became one of the great monuments of the ancient world, visited by later rulers who wanted to associate themselves with his legend. Julius Caesar visited it. Augustus Caesar reportedly placed a golden crown on the tomb and scattered flowers. Caligula, according to some ancient accounts, removed Alexander's breastplate and wore it.
And then the tomb disappeared. Sometime in late antiquity, the location of Alexander's burial place was lost. Despite centuries of searching, despite numerous claims and proposed identifications, despite the enormous historical and political significance of finding it, no one has definitively located the tomb of Alexander the Great. It remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of archaeology, the final resting place of the man who changed the ancient world, hidden somewhere beneath the streets and modern buildings of Alexandria, or perhaps lost entirely to the sea, or the slow reshaping of the landscape by time. The disappearance of Alexander's tomb is, in its own way, a kind of completing irony. He had buried his friend with the most elaborate ceremony in history. He had built a monument to loss that was also a monument to power. And then he died and became, ultimately, the unfound burial, the missing king, the presence that cannot be located, no matter how hard we look. But perhaps that is appropriate. Some presences are too large to be contained by a tomb. Some kings refuse, even in death, to stay still. Section 12. The role of music, lament, and mourning rituals. There is a sound to the Macedonian royal funeral that we cannot hear anymore, but that we can imagine if we are quiet and patient and allow the imagination to work.
Imagine the aulos. This was a double-piped wind instrument, played by blowing through a reed, producing a sound that ancient descriptions suggest was penetrating and distinctive, somewhere between what we might recognize as an oboe and something more nasal and insistent. A sound that carried outdoors and cut through crowds and had a quality of urgent expressiveness that made it the instrument of choice for ceremonies of all kinds in the ancient Greek world. At funerals, the aulos played. Its sound marked the transition from ordinary time to ceremonial time, from the everyday to the sacred. When the aulos began, something had changed. Something was happening that required a different quality of attention. At the prothesis, music surrounded the body. The aulos played, and the women mourned. The sound of lamentation in the ancient world was not what our modern funerary culture would recognize. It was not restrained. It was not quiet. It was loud and rhythmic and deliberate, a performance of grief that was simultaneously genuine and formal, both felt and practiced, both spontaneous and governed by convention. The specific forms of lamentation varied. There were wordless wails, the kind of sound that comes from a body in acute distress. There were rhythmic cries, the raising and dropping of the voice in a pattern that was half music and half keening. There were actual songs, lamentation poetry sung in the presence of the dead, verses that named the person being mourned, that catalogued their virtues, that expressed the magnitude of the loss in formal language.
Professional mourners, women whose specific skill and role in society was the performance of this ritual grief, might be employed for important funerals. Their practiced voices and their ability to sustain the lamentation over hours being qualities that could be contracted and paid for. The ancient Greeks and Macedonians understood something about grief that many modern cultures have lost, that mourning needs a form, that grief left entirely shapeless can be crushing, immobilizing, impossible to pass through. By providing grief with a structure, a sequence of ritual actions and sounds and behaviors that were expected and recognized, the funeral rite gave mourners something to do with their loss. The lamentation was a container. It held the grief while the grief was at its most raw and overwhelming, and it moved the mourners through it in a progression that had a shape, a beginning, a middle, and an end.
The procession itself, the ekphora, the carrying of the body or the bones from one place to another, was also scored with sound. The aulos continued, the mourners continued. The sound of the feet of those in procession, the rhythm of movement through space, added its own element. There was something in the experience of moving together, of making a collective journey with the dead, that served important psychological and social functions. Grief that is shared is different from grief that is solitary. The procession made it shared. It brought the whole community into the same slow movement, the same direction, the same acknowledgement of what had been lost. At the pyre, the sounds changed. The crackling and roaring of the fire itself became the dominant sound. The mourners might fall into a different kind of silence in the face of the fire, or they might maintain their lamentation through it, the sound of human grief competing with the sound of the flames. At Hephaestion's pyre, where singers had been placed inside the hollow sirens, the music was architectural in its ambition, designed to fill the space around the fire with a sound that was larger than ordinary human voice, that came from unexpected directions, that made the boundary between the natural and the mythological feel permeable and uncertain. The games that followed a major royal funeral were also, in a sense, sound. The clash of weapons in athletic competition, the shouts of athletes and spectators, the music of celebration that existed in deliberate tension with the music of mourning. Funeral games, a tradition that goes back to Homer, where Achilles organizes games in honor of Patroclus, were a way of channeling the energy of grief into competitive performance, of honoring the dead through the demonstration of excellence among the living. Alexander organized funeral games for Philip. He organized them again on an extraordinary scale for Hephaestion. The games were loud, energetic, full of life, and they were inseparable from the death that had prompted them. After the games, after the pyre, after the placement of the bones in the golden chest and the sealing of the tomb, a different kind of sound followed the Macedonian royal funeral, the sound of the feast. The peridipnon, the funeral meal, was a gathering of the community around food and drink in honor of the dead. It was loud and warm and full of wine, and the mingling of grief with the pleasure of company and nourishment. It was, in its way, the most human part of the whole sequence, the moment when the ancient Macedonians stopped performing ceremony and simply sat together with their loss, eating and drinking and remembering.
And then the feast ended too. The fires burned low. The aulos player packed up their instrument and went home. The professional mourners were paid and departed. The army returned to barracks. The nobility retreated to their quarters. The servants cleared the hall. And slowly, by degrees, the extraordinary noise and ceremony of the royal funeral gave way to ordinary silence. That silence, following the extraordinary sound of everything that had preceded it, must have been weighted. It settled on the court the way snow settles on a landscape that has recently been noisy, transforming everything, making the familiar strange, changing the acoustic of the world. The king was gone. The ceremony that had marked his going was complete. The tomb was sealed. The great tumulus would be heaped. And in the absence of all the ritual noise, the reality of the loss could begin to be absorbed in the quieter, slower, more private way that grief ultimately requires.
Music, lament, procession, fire, games, feast. The sounds of a Macedonian royal funeral form a kind of arc from the intimate and private in the quiet of the prothesis chamber to the vast and public at the roaring pyre and the noisy competition, and back again to the intimate and private in the gathering around a shared table. The dead were sent off not in silence, but in sound. Sound was the medium of honor. And then, when everything was done and the tomb was sealed and the great tumulus was heaped over everything, the silence that followed was deeper for everything that had preceded it. Section 13. Women in the funeral rite. Throughout this story, women have appeared at important moments. The women who washed the body, the women who mourned, the woman in the antechamber of Tomb 2. Let us now give them the fuller attention they deserve, because the role of women in the Macedonian royal funerary tradition is complex, significant, and sometimes surprising. In the broader Greek world, women were the primary custodians of the dead in the early stages of the funeral. This role was ancient, prescribed, and deeply embedded in social and religious custom. The washing and dressing of the body was women's work in the ritual sense, meaning it was work that carried spiritual significance and that required the specific participation of women. Male relatives and male members of the community would have roles in other parts of the ceremony, but the preparation of the body was almost universally described in ancient sources as something women did. In the Macedonian royal context, the women involved in these initial preparations would have been female members of the royal household, high-ranking women of the court, women connected to the dead person by blood or by service. The preparation they performed was not merely practical. It was the last act of intimate care that would be performed for the body before it underwent its transformation in the fire. The washing, the anointing, the dressing, these were acts of love as much as ritual. The last expressions of a relationship that death had ended. The lamentation performed by women during the prothesis was equally significant. The ancient Greek tradition of female lamentation has been studied extensively by scholars of gender and religion, and what emerges is a picture of women occupying a unique and powerful position in the ritual ecology of death. Lamentation was not merely emotional expression, it was performance with a specific social and religious function. The mourning of the dead by women activated something in the cosmological order, acknowledged the death publicly, summoned the community's attention to the reality of the loss. To be mourned by women in the proper way was to have one's death taken seriously, honored, incorporated into the collective understanding of the community. The role of women in the procession, the ekphora, is less clearly documented for the Macedonian royal context, though it was present in the broader Greek tradition.
Women walked in the procession, their dress and manner signalling mourning. Their presence transformed the procession from a military or political event into something with a more personal, domestic dimension. They represented the household mourning its own, the private grief made public.
The most striking female presence in the Virgina material is, as we have already touched on, the woman in the antechamber of Tomb 2. Her remains deserve careful attention. The forensic analysis of her bones shows a woman who was, by the standards of the ancient world, relatively young at death, probably in her late 20s to mid-30s, though precise age estimates from bone analysis carried significant uncertainty. Her leg showed evidence of a healed injury, and among her grave goods was a quiver of arrows and what appears to have been a gilded quiver case of extraordinary quality. This combination, youth, a healed leg wound, a golden burial with her own wreath, and weapons among her grave goods, has prompted some researchers to suggest she was a woman of martial culture, possibly from the Scythian or other steppe peoples to the north, someone who had entered the Macedonian royal world through marriage or alliance or capture, and whose original identity as a warrior woman had been honored at her burial rather than erased. The description of her as an Amazon figure, a term used metaphorically rather than literally by some researchers, captures the way in which her burial seems to draw on a different tradition from the standard Macedonian royal female burial, while still giving her full royal honors.
We have mentioned heroization several times in passing. The idea that a Macedonian king who died properly, whose funeral was conducted correctly and completely, was elevated through that ceremony into a new category of being, into the status of hero. Let us now explore what that meant in practice, because it is central to understanding why the Macedonian royal funeral was so elaborate, so expensive, so carefully executed. The hero, in ancient Greek religious understanding, was a figure who existed in the space between the human and the divine. Heroes were not gods, though some of them were said to have divine parentage. They were beings who had lived as humans, who had accomplished extraordinary things during their lives, and who, after death, retained a kind of active spiritual presence in the world. They could be called upon, they could protect, they could intercede. Their graves were sites of power, places where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was thinner, where a prayer or an offering might actually reach something that could hear it. The most famous heroes in Greek tradition, Achilles, Heracles, Theseus, Diomedes, were the subjects of active cult worship. Communities maintained their tombs, made offerings at them, invoked their protection. The heroized dead were not passive presences. They were participants in the ongoing life of the community. They watched, they heard, they potentially acted.
For a Macedonian king to be heroized after death was therefore not a merely honorific designation. It was a real change in status, a transformation that made the dead king into a protective force for the dynasty and the kingdom. The proper funeral was the mechanism of this transformation. If the funeral was correct, if all the required elements were present, if the pyre burned completely, if the bones were properly collected and placed, if the tomb was properly sealed and equipped, then the transformation was achieved. The king had crossed the threshold. He was no longer merely a dead man. He was a hero. The Argead claim to descent from Heracles was the ideological foundation for this aspiration. Heracles had already demonstrated in the mythology that the Macedonians understood as historical, that a figure of Macedonian royal lineage could achieve divine transcendence.
Heracles had been cremated on his own pyre, on Mount Aeta, and had ascended to Olympus to take his place among the gods. His story was the template. Every Macedonian king who went to his pyre was, in some sense, reenacting the apotheosis of Heracles, following the ancestral pattern, claiming the same possibility of transcendence that the great progenitor of the line had already realized.
Alexander took this further than anyone. His campaigns were in part a deliberate program of identifying himself with divine ancestors. He claimed descent not only from Heracles on his father's side, but from Achilles on his mother's side. His visit to the oracle at Siwa in Egypt, where he received a response that he interpreted as confirming his divine paternity, suggesting he was literally the son of Zeus Ammon, was a turning point in the public construction of his divine identity. By the later years of his reign, Alexander was being worshipped as a god in parts of his empire while he was still alive, a development that created significant tension with his Macedonian companions, who held older traditions about the boundary between mortal and divine. His request that Hephaestion be granted divine honors after death, even if the oracle scaled back his ambition to heroic rather than fully divine status, reflects the same cosmological aspiration. The people Alexander loved most were to occupy the highest possible positions in the hierarchy of the dead. They were to be, if not gods, then the next closest thing.
The practical expression of heroization in the burial context was the creation of a hieron, a shrine or sacred site associated with the grave of the heroized person. At this site, offerings could be made, prayers could be spoken, the presence of the hero could be invoked. The maintenance of such a site was itself an ongoing expression of the community's relationship with its honored dead, a regular acknowledgement that the heroized king remained a participant in the life of the kingdom, that the connection between the living and the dead had not been severed, but transformed into something that could be actively maintained. There is something deeply moving about this concept when held gently and allowed to settle. The idea that the dead do not simply vanish, but they remain accessible in some form, that the relationship does not end but changes, that the proper care of the dead creates something that endures and protects. This is not unique to ancient Macedonia. It is one of the most widespread and persistent human beliefs, appearing in cultures across the world and across time. The Macedonian royal funerary tradition is a specific, highly elaborated, politically sophisticated version of this universal human need, the need to believe that love outlasts death, that honor outlasts the body, that the people we have lost are not entirely gone. Section 15. The Legacy Beneath the Earth. What archaeology revealed.
November of 1977 in Vergina was cold and grey, as Greek Novembers tend to be. The excavation team, led by Manolis Andronicus, had been working through the summer and into the autumn on the great tumulus, removing the carefully deposited soil of millennia with the patience that serious archaeological work demands. By November, they were reaching the depth at which they hoped to find something, though after decades of largely disappointing excavations across the Aegae necropolis, hope had a somewhat muted quality. And then a wall appeared, cut stone, too well made to be accidental, too precisely placed to be anything other than intentional construction. The painted plaster, the facade, the sealed doors. Andronicus later wrote about the moment with a restraint that barely contained the emotion underneath. Standing at the entrance to Tomb 2, before the sealed marble door, before the room that had not been entered in over 2,000 years, the realization that this was intact, that it had never been robbed, that whatever was inside was exactly as it had been left, produced a kind of vertigo that no amount of professional training fully prepares you for.
The sealed door was opened with care. The interior was examined with electric torches. The room came into focus. The stone walls, the plaster, the floors covered with objects, weapons, bronze vessels, remains of organic materials, and at the center of the chamber, the marble sarcophagus. Inside it, the golden larnax. Inside that, the purple-wrapped bones of the dead king and the gold wreath. The discovery was announced to the world and immediately became one of the great archaeological events of the century. The Greek government, the international academic community, the media, all converged on the small village of Vergina. The debate about the identity of the tomb's occupant began almost immediately and has continued with varying degrees of intensity ever since. The central question, is it Philip II, has been argued from every possible angle. The forensic evidence for Philip's identification is substantial but not conclusive. The skull damage consistent with the eye wound, the asymmetric greaves consistent with the leg injury, the dating of the objects to the latter half of the 4th century BCE, the location at the Aegae necropolis, the quality and quantity of the grave goods consistent with royal burial.
Arguments against the identification have been made. Some researchers have proposed that the tomb belongs to Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, who was also buried at Aegae. The counter-arguments to this have focused on the dating of specific objects, on forensic analysis of the bone remains, and on the style of the tomb's architecture. The debate continues, though the majority scholarly opinion at present favors the identification with Philip II. What is beyond debate is the significance of the discovery. The Vergina tombs gave us our first physical contact with the world of the Macedonian royal court in the period of Philip and Alexander. Before Vergina, our knowledge of this world was filtered entirely through texts, through coins, through fragments and ruins, and the imperfect record of surviving written accounts. After Vergina, we had objects, we had materials, we had the specific, tangible evidence of how these people lived and how they honored their dead. The museum that now exists at Vergina, built into the tumulus itself so that visitors approach and enter through the mound, is one of the most affecting archaeological museums in the world. You descend into it. You walk in the direction of the buried tombs. The light changes as you go deeper, the natural light of the Greek morning, giving way to the artificial but thoughtful lighting of the museum interior. And then you see the objects, the golden larnax, the oak wreath, the greaves with their slight asymmetry, the ivory pieces of the decorated shield, the drinking vessels, the weapons, the evidence in gold and iron and silver and bone of a world that was vivid and real and is now, 2,000 years later, accessible to us through the patience of archaeologists and the preservation of sealed stone. The ongoing forensic work at Vergina is producing new findings as technology advances. Techniques for analyzing ancient DNA from cremated remains, long considered impossible or unreliable, are being refined. Isotope analysis can provide information about diet, geographic origin,
and health that was unavailable to earlier researchers. Three-dimensional scanning of the bone fragments has produced more detailed information about the injuries visible in the remains. Each new study adds something. The tombs, sealed for so long, have been speaking slowly ever since they were opened. Each decade of research extracting a little more from the evidence preserved in the darkness.
The story of the Vagina excavation is also, in its way, a human story about the archaeologist himself. Manolis Andronakis dedicated his professional life to the excavation of the Aegae necropolis. He worked through decades when the results were disappointing, when the looted tombs yielded little, when the dream of finding an intact royal burial remained unfulfilled. He was, by 1977, in his 60s, not a young man, not someone for whom patience came easily anymore. And then the great tumulus gave him everything. He died in 1992, having spent the 15 years after the discovery working to publish the findings, to defend his identifications, to continue the excavation of the site. His excavation diary, his published work, and the museum he helped design are his monument. Like the kings he excavated, he left something behind, something that endures. Section 16. The Long Sleep of Kings. And so we come to the end of our journey.
We have walked through the full arc of it, from the grey mountains and wide plains of ancient Macedonia to the sealed chamber of a stone tomb where a golden box waits in the dark. We have moved through the rituals of preparation, the careful washing of the body, the placement of the coin for the ferryman, the dressing in purple and the crowning with gold. We have stood, at least in imagination, by the funeral pyre as it roared against the night sky, the bones of a king transformed by fire into something that could fit inside a golden chest. We have moved through the architecture of the tomb, the painted walls, the hunting scene on the facade, the barrel vault rising above the chamber in which the dead were installed for eternity. We have followed Hephaestion funeral procession from Ecbatana to Babylon, watched the 60-meter pyre rise in steps towards the sky, heard the singers in the hollow sirens begin their lament. We have watched Alexander, the greatest conqueror of the ancient world, lay beside the body of his dead friend for a day and a half and refused to be moved. And we have seen him afterward grow into something cold and grandiose and grief-driven in his planning of a ceremony that no amount of money could make large enough.
We have thought about what it meant to the ancient Macedonians that death was not an ending, that the dead continued, that the proper funeral made possible a continuation, a transformation, a kind of elevation that kept the dead king accessible, present, protective. We have thought about the coins on the eyes, the fare for the ferryman, the small practical provision for the first need of the journey. We have thought about the women who washed the bodies, who mourned with their voices and their torn hair, who prepared and decorated and honored the dead with the intimacy that love requires. And we have thought about the strange arc of time that connects a sealed stone chamber in 4th century BCE Macedonia to a Greek archaeologist in November of 1977, carefully lifting the lid of a golden chest and finding inside it the wrapped bones of a king and a gold wreath that had been waiting for 2,000 years to be seen again.
There is something particular about the way that story feels in the dark, in the quiet of late night, when the day is long over and the mind is soft and the borders between things are a little less sharp than they are in the full bright light of ordinary waking life. The kings of Macedonia have been sleeping for a very long time, the long sleep that begins when the tomb is sealed and the last footstep walks away and the darkness closes in. That sleep has lasted more than 23 centuries. In the absolute silence of sealed stone, they have been resting. In the dark that no lamp has illuminated and no eye has seen, they have been present, unchanging, waiting with the patience that only the dead can manage. Consider what 23 centuries of darkness actually means. Think of the events that have unfolded above the sealed tomb during all that time. The Hellenistic kingdoms rising and warring and dissolving. The Roman legions marching through Macedonia, their iron sandals on the old roads. The Byzantine Empire inheriting the Eastern Mediterranean. The Ottoman expansion, the centuries of another culture and another language and another faith settling over the same landscape where the Argead kings had hunted and fought and been buried. Villages growing and shifting, languages changing so thoroughly that a person from Philip's court transported forward in time would understand nothing spoken around them. Centuries of rain and winter and summer and harvest and famine and war, all of it happening above on the surface of the world, while below the mound the golden larnax sat undisturbed in its chamber, and the wreath held its shape, and the bones rested in their purple wrapping, and nothing changed, nothing at all. The great tumulus did its job. It kept the world out. It kept the kings safe. All the upheaval of history, all the conquest and reconquest and transformation that the land of ancient Macedonia endured over more than 2 millennia, none of it reached the sealed chamber. The stone held, the vault held, the darkness inside remained absolute. Until November 1977, when human hands broke the seal and light entered the chamber again for the first time in 2,300 years. It is one of the most extraordinary facts I know, that light, after such an interval, that the first thing the golden oak wreath saw after all that time was the beam of an electric torch held by a Greek archaeologist in the 20th century, that the bones had been lying in their purple cloth, in their gold chest, under their 16-pointed star, through all of that history. And then suddenly they were found. They were seen. They were, in a sense, encountered. And whatever name we give to the person those bones once were, whatever the debates of scholarship ultimately determine about the identity of the occupant of Tomb 2, the fact of the encounter remains. The fact that someone placed those bones there with enormous care, and then the world moved on for 23 centuries, and then someone found them, is a fact with weight and resonance that no amount of academic precision can diminish. There is something in us that needs that encounter,
something that needs to know the dead are still there, still findable, still accessible to the care of the living. The archaeologist who opens a sealed tomb and finds its contents intact is doing something that participates, in a strange and secular way, in the same impulse that drove the Macedonians to place a gold wreath on the bones of their king. The impulse to honor, the impulse to find, the impulse to say, this person was real, and their reality still matters, and we are not going to let it be simply lost. There is something almost envious about it, from the perspective of someone lying awake in the night, someone whose mind is still turning over the small anxieties and unfinished thoughts of the day. The kings have no such concerns. Their armor is laid down, their swords are resting. The weight of governance and war and the unceasing demands of the living, all of that has been given over. The pyre transformed them, the golden chest contains them, the sealed stone protects them, and beneath the heap of the great tumulus, in the absolute darkness of deep time, they rest.
The rituals that brought them there were extraordinary, but the destination was the same one that awaits everyone. The final stillness, the long quiet, the sleep that follows a life of extraordinary effort and noise and weight and pain and joy and anger and love. The rest that comes after everything. In the ancient Macedonian cosmology, that rest was not the end. It was a transition, a passing through, a movement from one kind of being to another. The heroized king rested and then became something else, something watchful and protective, something accessible to those who called on him in the right way, with the right words, at the right place. The sleep was not permanent in the way that modern understanding might frame it. It was a pause in a larger arc.
But perhaps the thing that matters most at the end of all of this is simpler than cosmology. It is the fact that they were cared for. That when these people died, people who had known them and relied on them and feared them and in some cases loved them, those people did not simply turn away. They gathered, they washed the body, they placed the coin, they built the fire, they collected the bones, they wrapped them in purple and placed them in gold and set a gold wreath on top and sealed the box and put it in a room built specifically to hold it, and then sealed that room and heaped a mountain of earth over everything to keep it safe and inviolable for as long as the earth endured. They did all of that for someone they did not want to lose. The rituals were elaborate, yes. The expense was staggering. The symbolism was dense and multi-layered and connected to cosmologies that most of us would need a course of study to fully understand. But underneath all of that, beneath the gold and the fire and the painted walls and the ceremonial architecture, underneath everything that makes the Macedonian royal funeral a subject of historical and archaeological interest, there is just this: people took care of their dead.
With the best things they had, with their most precious materials, with their most skilled craftsmen, with their music and their voices and their grief. They took care of their dead the way you take care of something you cannot bear to let go of, even knowing that letting go is inevitable, even knowing that all the gold in the world cannot bring them back. And 2,000 years later, we sit with the story of it. We let it move through us, the way old stories do when the night is quiet and the mind is soft. We carry it for a while, this knowledge that people have always done this, have always found ways to honor the ones they lost, have always tried to make the passing beautiful and dignified and worthy of the life that came before it. We carry it, and it settles something in us, some anxiety we maybe didn't know we were carrying, some small fear about impermanence and loss, and the question of whether anything lasts. Something lasts. The gold larnax is still there, the reef is still intact, the bones are still inside, the 16-pointed star still shines on the lid of the chest. 2,000 years of darkness, and the oak leaves are still gold.
And tonight, somewhere in northern Greece, in the museum built into the side of the ancient mound, the golden chest of a Macedonian king rests in its case, and the wreath inside it holds its shape, and the silence around it is very deep. Let that silence carry you now. Let the long sleep of kings be your companion as your own sleep comes. Let the weight of all those centuries settle gently over you, the way the great tumulus settled over the tombs, slow and sure and deep, the dark earth pressing softly in every direction, the world above going on without urgency, the quiet below being simply and completely quiet. Think of the darkness inside that sealed stone chamber. Think of how absolute it was. No light, no sound, no change in temperature, no breath, no movement. Just the gold sitting gold in the black, and the bones resting in their purple, and the wreath holding its shape through century after century of perfect stillness. That kind of stillness is what sleep aspires to. That kind of letting go, that complete release of the need to be anywhere, or do anything, or know anything. That is what the body asks for when the day is done and the night has arrived and the last of the light is gone.
There is nowhere to go tonight, nothing to do. The kings have done it all. The pyres are long cold. The gold is still. The bones are resting. And in the sleep that follows everything, in the long dark that comes after ceremony and grief and fire and gold, and the last sealing of the door, there is something that is not quite silence and not quite sound, something very old, something that has been resting in the same place for 23 centuries and has made in that long staying a kind of peace with the darkness. Rest now. Let the mountains of ancient Macedonia rise in the soft distance of your imagination. Let the plain below them stretch out wide and grey. Let the hill with its sealed chambers sit in the stillness of deep night, as it has sat for so long, unchanged, unhurried, waiting with the patience of stone and gold for whatever comes next. And let yourself go slowly into the same quiet. The kings are sleeping. You can sleep too. If the slow history of ancient Macedonia helped you drift tonight, and if these calm stories from the past give your mind something soft to rest on,
please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to us.
We are working toward 1,000 subscribers, and that goal means the world to this small, peaceful channel. Every like, every subscription, every comment you leave brings us closer. If you have a little sleepy hype left in you, send it our way. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is on your clock, and whether the kings of Macedonia brought you any peace tonight. It is oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same slow stories. Thank you for being here. Thank you for resting here. Sleep well.